Okay. You feel good, Kira?
I feel great.
You feel
I'm
good?
so happy to be here.
We got to get the energy up because
Yeah,
people can't see us, but they can feel our energy. So,
excellent.
and
I always feel like the dance segments before these shows are awesome.
they were like, "Oh God, this is being recorded. This is my chair dance."
Right. My heart is doing a happy dance, even if my body isn't right now.
Yes, I love that. The heart is doing a happy dance.
All right, we will get started here in 15 seconds.
Okay.
Welcome to Women Thriving Unapologetically with Lynsie McKeown. Over the next hour, you will hear raw, honest, and inspiring conversation between Lynsie and her guests, discussing how to thrive, live joyfully, and abundantly in spite of life's challenges. Now, here is your host, Lynsie McKeown.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Women Thriving Unapologetically. I'm your host, Lynsie McKeown, and today's show is going to be incredible. We'll be diving into the topic of aging and intimacy and how tapping into our sexuality is essential as we age, as a way to stay connected to our creativity and enthusiasm for life. But before we invite our very special guest onto the show, let's take a moment to stop, pause, breathe, and connect. So today, bring your hands down to your lower belly. Now, this is the area of the womb. And even if you no longer have a physical womb, you still have an energetic womb. So we just want to place our hands gently on this area of our body. And if you're comfortable, you can close your eyes and just take several deep breaths in. And imagine that your breath can extend all the way down into the womb, filling it with breath and presence. These deep, deep breaths. And we just want to breathe into this space of creativity and feminine power with appreciation and gratitude. So often we have beliefs around our body, frustrations and pain in our body in this area. But instead, let's just shift our awareness to appreciation and gratitude for the power and the creativity that resides here. Take one more breath in and out. And then when you're ready, just bring yourself back. And so we wanted to bring our attention to this area of the body with some honor and some reverence, because our very special guest today is Kira Hauer. And she has been a women's empowerment coach for over 20 years. She received her Master's of Education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and is a member of the International Coaches Federation. As a women's empowerment coach, Kira has worked extensively with executives, women leaders, and presented at women's leadership conferences, and is a contributing editor to Enlightened Power, How Women Are Transforming the Practice of Leadership. Kira is also a certified sex, love, and relationships coach and works with women on more personal challenges, such as life transitions, menopause and aging, divorce, and new motherhood. Currently, she offers one-on-one coaching and has a self-guided online course for women over 40, the Sexuality and Aging Masterclass. So her passion is busting the myths about sexuality and aging. And one way she does this is by helping women understand that the value of pleasure is their birthright. And when they connect to their sexual and sensual energy, they are able to embrace their aging process as a source of creativity, enthusiasm, and excitement. So with that, let's invite on Kira Hauer. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I can't tell you how excited I am to have you on the show. A mutual friend of ours put us in contact, and I have just been a fan from day one. And am really passionate as well as about bringing these topics to the table. So shall we just go ahead and dive right in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so this is a topic that is important for women of any age. I mean, the title is about, women thriving in intimacy and pleasure over 50, but this can be for new moms feeling exhausted and thinking that their libido is gone forever, and for women that are in their 40s and, having the first experiences with perimenopause, as well as women that are late 40s, 50s, maybe even to the 60s, going through menopause. So there are a lot of beliefs around aging and sexuality for women. And I'd love to start first by just talking about what some of those myths and challenges are.
Sure. Yeah, I think that one of the most important things for women and men to think about as human beings is that we are always changing. Our bodies are constantly changing. And yet we live in a society which is pretty youth obsessed, right? So I think that many women, probably most, I would say, at least in our culture, have this ideal about aging that we somewhere in our mind and heart and soul believe that we should freeze ourselves at a certain age, right? And then we start to fight it. We start to fight that process. And I think when it comes to our sexual health and wellness and well-being, we don't recognize that that changes too, right? But the biggest myth is that it gets worse. It doesn't have to get worse. It can actually get better. So that's a mindset shift, right? If we stop and really think about how do we view aging and sexuality together, right? That we have a cultural belief that sexuality will decline as we age, and it simply doesn't need to be true. Now, I'm not saying it isn't true. It is true for many people, but that's also because that's the belief that they buy into.
Yeah, and it's a belief that you just hear from a very young age. And if we hear something over and over again, repeated, it becomes a belief, because
Right.
that's how we learn, right? Through
Right.
repetition. And
Exactly.
it seems to me that what I hear you saying is that if we really want to bust the myths around sexuality, we have to start to bust some of the myths around the aging process.
Absolutely. 100%. Yes. And, that was why I went into that portion of women's empowerment around sexuality, is because I was, a few years, I was a few years out from turning 50. And I thought, I have this belief. I have this belief that I think probably isn't true. And I would like to debunk this for myself. And I want to explore it. And that's really what happened, is I got curious about this belief that I had. And so I decided to embark on, the training process. And it was through my training process that I learned that this notion of a woman's menopause in Asia is referred to as the second spring.
Oh, I love
And
that.
which was so beautiful. I couldn't believe it when I first heard that as a concept. And it was really then and there that I realized that this is so cultural, right? That we can change the way that we think about ourselves, our bodies, our lives, our vibrancy, our creativity, if we change the way that we feel about our aging process in general. Now, that being said, of course, there is a reality to aging that happens to both men and women, right? But we're focusing on women's bodies here, and so yes, you need to pay attention to what's happening, and I would say pay attention earlier rather than later.
How early?
Or like 30s, 40s,
30s,
just
40s.
pay attention. What's happening in your body, and often the hormonal piece of it happens much earlier than we realize. So So recognizing that, having your hormones checked regularly, is really important because your body will change. And that's okay. It should. It's doing what it's supposed to do, right?
And I think sometimes it's difficult because for women, especially because, it's been my experience that the body was just great all the way up till early 40s. And then there was like some little things that were coming in, but it seems like the real big changes seem to happen all at once. And we know that's not true, that we're changing and we're aging every single day, but it does seem a little bit like it's speeding up almost in our mid to late 40s, moving into 50s. So I can see how the mindset, because for me, even my mindset has started to trip me up a little bit around that and what I'm feeling in my body. So, what have you used for yourself, or what do you offer your clients on how to manage the mind around this and change the perspective when things seem to be changing so quickly?
Yeah, well, I think it's a combination, right? So I like to look at the triad of mind, body, and emotions, right? So from the mind, what are the thoughts? What are the beliefs that you hold about your aging process and about your own body, right? And about your vibrancy? And how do those beliefs then impact you emotionally, right? What are the feelings around this? Is there fear? Is there shame? Is there, um, you know, frustration? There's all sorts of
Mm-hmm.
emotions and those emotions really impact how our body responds also, right? So building self-compassion, first of all, building patience, and then educating, understanding what's actually happening with your body is really important. So the body piece of it is connecting with your doctor, finding a hormone specialist. Don't be afraid of estrogen. We need estrogen. There were terrible, terrible disservices done to women when the estrogen scare came out, and granted, there are certainly women who can't take estrogen, you know, but a lot of women can. And I think it's really important to look at that as a possibility and to understand, if you can, how you can get your hormones to kind of level off a little bit. And there's lots of holistic things you can do as well.
And I love this piece, like, educating yourself um, really gives you power to make better choices for yourself, but also allows you to start to unravel some of those beliefs, because if you're not educated on what's really going on in your body
Right.
and getting information from someone that's qualified to give you great information. So I'd say that because we Google a lot of stuff nowadays and get so many different mixed messages, but really
Right.
educating yourself so that you can start to take that power back and start to see things through a different lens.
Mhm.
And I love that lens of the second spring, because, if we've been told all of our lives, oh, once you hit, 45 or 50, it's over. Then, like, wait a second. No, it's not. Spring is that time of vibrancy and renewal. And how can you look at your life from this place of vitality again and something exciting?
Right, exactly. So I think that, that's another piece of this, right? Around mindset, emotions, and body, is to really think about, if I were to frame my midlife and beyond as a second spring, what would I create?
Yeah.
And I think that so many women spend their earlier part of their life taking care of other people, taking care of their careers, taking care, sort of being the human givers, right? There's a lot of focus outward. And what's beautiful about midlife and beyond is that there's this just natural shift that happens where women begin to say, you know what, I want to do it differently.
Mhm.
It can be a wake up call. It can happen slowly, and it can, as you said, it can feel like it happens overnight. But there is a shift that happens, and that to me is part of the beauty and the wisdom of menopause, is to be able to say, I'm at my midlife in my second half of my life here, right? How do I want to spend it now? And we have a tendency to reevaluate everything. And that's a really important conversation for women to have. And part of that, I hope, is also, what is my relationship with my own body
Mm.
and my sexual health and well-being? Because it's connected to my feeling like I'm thriving. And my fear and my worry is that so many women say, you know what, that part of myself is gone and I'm just going to walk away.
Mm.
And I think that that's such a shame, because it doesn't need to happen.
No, it doesn't. And I love that, ask yourself that question, what do I want to create? And how do I want the second half of my life to look like? It's a powerful, powerful question. And it kind of, I would love your perspective on this, is how is our sexuality and our sensuality connected to our creativity? Because if we want to create something, in my lineage, like the yoga lineage and meditation, our creative center is the womb, and we don't have to have a physical womb to tap into the energy that is there.
Right.
So what would you have to say to women about, as they're trying to create the second half of their lives, how important it is to connect to this area of our bodies?
Well, I think it starts with that mind-body connection, right? To believe that as a woman, you are born fertile, fertile of creativity,
Mm.
right? Whether you birth a child or not in your life, you are born fertile, and you are born with the birthright of pleasure. Okay. So pleasure being at the core of that. Pleasure is like the physical energy of that creativity. When you think about a time in your life when you're like just in the flow, and you're being your most creative, there's an energy to it, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's the same, it's kind of similar to an orgasmic energy, right? So for women as they age, to begin to think about their womb as their place, or their, whether you, like you said, whether you have it or not, for that part of oneself, to know that that source of creativity will be with you until your last breath.
Yes, I love that. Till your last breath, you have that creativity and that fertility,
Yeah,
and um, that source of power is there, whether you have the womb
right,
or not, whether you can
right,
birth a baby or not, whether you have
right.
ovaries or not. You're always overflowing with fertility and creativity, um, and you have that birthright to to pleasure, whether that comes through sexual pleasure or whether it comes through the pleasure of just creating something new and abundant for yourself.
Exactly.
Uh,
Exactly. We are creators. That's what we do, right? We're
yeah.
born to create.
Yes. So, you know, I have so many more questions around this, but we are leading up to our first break. So when we come back, I'd love to talk a little bit around what are some of the barriers or challenges that we have around tapping into this creative center within us. Um, and I think before you mentioned things like fear and shame, and we talked about some that beliefs are, but what are some of those specific things that can come in and block that flow of creativity and pleasure? So
Sure. Yeah.
go
Looking
ahead and
forward to
yeah, well, that's a big one. So
it is.
we'll have to come back for that one. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a very short break, and in this moment, just, ask yourself what it is that you want to create. It doesn't matter what age you are or what decade you're in. Just what would you love to tap into and create this next year or this next decade or for the second half of your life? And give yourself an opportunity in these next few moments to, play with that idea. And then we'll be back with Kira Hauer.
All right, great job. Good segment. Back in about 2.
How did that feel, Kira?
Great.
Good. I love this conversation.
I do too. I'm assuming we're still on live on Facebook. So
We are still live on
great.
Facebook. Hello, everyone.
Hello. Yeah, no, it's such an important conversation. I
Yeah.
think that's why I do the work.
Yeah. And, you know, for everyone on Facebook, if you want to drop some questions down into the Facebook comment section after the live segment of this, we'll stay on and see if we can answer some of those questions for you. Just take about another 2 or 3, 5 minutes, and delve a little bit more deeply into our into this topic if we don't cover everything here in this 1 hour, which is nearly impossible to do.
Definitely.
Yeah. So when we come back, you know, how do you feel about talking about some of those? Because I know wasn't quite on our
Oh, it's fine. I think it's probably the most important,
yeah.
Is to recognize the emotional piece of it. And especially, I was going to say, especially if people are in relationship. We're always in relationship. We're in relationship with ourselves. So that first and foremost is the one to look at. But, when we're in relationship with somebody else, it's really important to look at what are the emotional components in the context of that relationship that are impacting your sexual well-being.
Yeah, I love that piece. Like it's so difficult, especially for I think for women to put themselves first and know that they have to be in relationship with themselves first before they can have that thriving relationship, a partner.
Yeah, definitely.
Or in any other relationship that they have in their life, relationship to their work, relationship to their spirituality, all of that. So, yeah.
All right, we'll be coming back here in about 12 seconds.
12 seconds. Okay. Empowerment.com.
You're listening to Women Thriving Unapologetically with Lynsie McKeown. Have a question for Lynsie or her guests? Want to share your story? Email Lynsie at thrivingunapologetically@gmail.com. That's thrivingunapologetically@gmail.com. Now back to the show. Here again is Lynsie.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Thriving Unapologetically on Voice America's Empowerment Channel. I'm your host, Lynsie McKeown, and today we have Kira Hauer with us talking about intimacy and pleasure for women of all ages, but especially those that are in midlife. So welcome back. And Kira and I were talking before the second segment of the show and also during the break about some of those challenges that can come up for us around connecting to our creativity and to that space. And that's the womb space where we hold our greatest power and creativity. And with this area of the body, there can be not only the beliefs that we talked about before, but, this idea that there could be fear and a lot of shame around that. So Kira, what do you have to say, about how do we, start to process some of these emotions that we have that might be getting in the way of us tapping into our creativity and our second spring?
Well, I think the first part is really around awareness, right? It's about recognizing what your emotions are connected to your own sexuality. How do you feel about sex? What were you told as a child about sex? What do you believe? What are your beliefs, right? And those beliefs turn into emotions, again, often fear, shame, which shows up as resistance.
Oh, it's so fear and resistance. I
Yeah.
mean, fear and shame
So
as resistance.
fear and shame show up as resistance because let's face it, I mean, shame is one of those emotions that we will avoid at all costs.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful, scary emotion. And so what I work with my clients is to recognize where the shame comes from, and to better understand it and to befriend it. To not try to push away the shame or fear, because when we do that, it actually gets stronger
Creates even more resistance.
and it creates even more resistance. So I work with my clients to be able to integrate it, to understand it first, to know where it comes from, and then to be able to really understand that there's a part of oneself that is still a child, really.
Yeah.
There's a part of ourselves, it's all of that inner child work where we're just trying to stay safe. That's all. It's as simple as that. And yet that's not simple at all, right? To do
No.
that work is complex and it's deep and it's big, it's important, but we have to really look at that. And it isn't always, young child stuff, I would say most of my clients that I work with, when there's shame involved, has something to do with their teenage years, their first sexual encounters
Mhm.
or experiences. They can really create an imprint on one's sense of health and sexual self. And so looking at what those imprints are and with the impact that they've had is really, really important.
I love that you bring that up because, our beliefs are created either through repetition, something that we've heard or seen or felt over and over again, or through a significant emotional event. So our first sexual experiences can actually be quite traumatic, maybe with a little t or a big T, but they can have a big imprint on our view about our bodies and whether this physical act can be beautiful and powerful or shameful, and intimidating. And, this idea of shame is a huge topic. And you talked about it creating a lot of resistance. So I would imagine that having the piece that you talked about having self-compassion as you're touching on shame is essential so that the resistance and the fear doesn't, create more of a protective barrier, and that you have to be soft and gentle going into this. And what would you say? Because, you know, the shame is there to protect you from something, and yet, we want to be able to move beyond that. So how do we move beyond these protective barriers? And why is that important? Like why? Because if it's there to protect us and we want to feel, and it's help it to keep us feel safe, why would we want to go up against this and feel unsafe and afraid and have to deal with all of that? What's on the other side of that?
Well, what's on the other side is pleasure,
Yeah.
right? That's what's on the other side, right? Big pleasure and creativity, right?
The pleasure that comes
So
not just from, sexual experiences, but the pleasure of creating something beautiful.
exactly. So what needs to happen is first creating a sense of safety, both emotionally and physically. So letting your body know, letting your nervous system know that you are safe, and really integrating safety, working on building safety and having people really resource in their body where they feel the most safe. And then beginning to titrate pleasure into their lives, into their body, beginning to feel what pleasure feels like. And for a lot of women, unfortunately, they've never really experienced true, I don't want to say true sexual pleasure, but their own capability and potential of sexual pleasure. And
So go ahead and
no,
finish.
I was just going to say that, in our culture, first of all, we have such terrible sex ed. I mean, just horrendous. And especially for women 50 and older. I mean, let's face it, we got nothing, right? Just nothing. We got worse than nothing. And I think that there is a belief that women at least for older generations. This is one of the things I'm most excited about with younger generations is I don't think that they buy this belief anymore. But that women's sexual pleasure takes a back seat to male sexual pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the construct that we have in the United States, at least, and certainly in other cultures. And it's a patriarchal, belief. It's an effect of the patriarchy, and we have to own that as true. And so women, I think, really need to look at what role do they play in that? Can they own their own sexual pleasure?
Mm-hmm.
And if they do, that means that they have to find their voice. It means they have to believe, number one, that their body is capable of it, which 100% it is. I think that we were talking before about, obstacles. And one of the biggest challenges is that so many women feel like there's something wrong with their bodies. And it's simply not true. And because girls and boys don't get proper sex ed around pleasure, instead they get it around fear, right? It's all about how to not get pregnant, how to not get STDs. It's not about pleasure.
Yeah.
And it's not about mutual pleasure. So my hope is that that's changing for these generations. And I think that I hope the teenagers of today, especially the girls, are saying, my pleasure matters.
Yeah, and I love that. My pleasure matters. And, because we do live in a patriarchal society, it's not just our pleasure in the bedroom that comes second, but our pleasure in all areas of our life comes second. And so it's about finding that voice to say, my pleasure matters.
Absolutely.
And if we actually start with probably the scarier part of that, which is the sexual pleasure, and can tap into that source of our creative power, then it becomes easier to find voice in the other areas of our life because we've tapped into that wellspring of creativity, power, and just that vitality that you spoke of earlier. So I love that. I mean, there's so many pieces here that I feel like, oh my gosh, we need 3 hours. Probably more than that.
Absolutely. I can come back.
A week retreat. Let's do that.
Part 2.
And so, going back to pleasure and saying, okay, pleasure is my birthright. I deserve to have pleasure in my life. You often talk about how to use your 5 senses to bring that in, because if we have a lot of beliefs or shame around pleasure, I would imagine sometimes it's easier to come in using that gentle approach and maybe using your 5 senses in other ways to actually become aware of what does please you. Can you speak on that, like how to use the 5 senses to experience pleasure?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, Esther Perel talks about eroticism, right? And I would highly recommend anybody who doesn't follow her to look into her work. She talks about the difference between pleasure and eroticism, right? And so I would like to pose, for example, let's say that you're eating a strawberry, right? Let's take taste, right? Or chocolate, something that so many people love, right? You can eat something kind of mindlessly. You can eat it because you're hungry and it tastes good. You can eat it because you know that you need the nutrients, right? But if you put on a sensual lens to something that you're eating and you really slow down and let something really melt in your mouth, or if you really taste and feel the texture of a strawberry or a raisin or the chocolate and just let it melt and see what happens, right? And play with different foods, different tastes, right? Play with cold, play with hot, and really it can open up, again, that creativity of exploration of one's body. That's really what the five senses is about. It's about saying, how does my body react and thrive with different senses? Some people like things very, very soft, right? And that feels arousing to them. Other people like things that are kind of sharp, you know. Other people like things that might be sticky, right? Many women do not like to be cold, right? They have to be warm in order, right? Does that resonate? Or unless they're having a hot flash, and then of course everything comes off, right?
The rules change.
All the rules change, right? So the senses are the best tool. There are really two amazing tools for one's body that every single human being has: the five senses and your breath, to build your sexual and sensual energy. So smell is something that can really open up your sensual sense, your sensual arousal. And it can also turn you off, right? So if you imagine all of the different smells, there's a plethora of smells that you could play with. And that's what it's really about. So it's about getting playful, getting curious. What does turn my body on? That's the question, right? Let me see what turns my body on. Opening up the refrigerator and saying, what's the most sensual thing in this refrigerator, and what can I do with this, right?
I'm gonna date myself as like that's like the 9.5 weeks.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So many people will think back on that.
Yeah.
Right. So creating your own scene in your own, kitchen, starting with yourself. That's the thing. Starting with yourself to really understand what does create some level of arousal, right? And there could be different, something can feel soft, but it doesn't feel sensual. It doesn't do that little wake up of, ooh, ooh, that feels different, right? Or that feels good. So, taste, smell, sight, to be able to look around, what is it that makes a woman feel a sense of desire? Because women need desire before they can reach arousal. So what creates desire visually, right? That's an important thing to think about. How do you turn down the volume of the to-do list when you're looking around your room and you're saying, okay, this is my time to play with the five senses? There's going to be something that you see that you say, that doesn't work. That's kind of jarring to me. So put it away, clean it up, do something, put some candles on, look at the candles, have the open the curtain. Exactly. Open the curtains and let the sun in, So, touch, smell, sight, sound, music.
Oh, music really is so important, I think.
Music is so important. There are plenty of musical paths that one can take, right? Options that can turn up or down desire. Some people love, there's so many associations that we have with music, so it's really important, but it's important.
Yeah, don't be playing piano, because I'll think back to high school and my first experience. I don't want that.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Right. So we have to set, it sounds so trite, but setting the mood matters. It really matters, especially to women. So sound is definitely, playing with music is important.
And I love just take that time to set your space. I mean, there is something about that, in the moment, spontaneity that can be
Sure.
erotic and arousing. But setting the space and just knowing that this is about a time to really connect in a really beautiful way. And that piece that you said about, start with yourself, like let's start with ourselves so that we really understand what it is that brings us pleasure, whether it's like the pleasure of taste, the pleasure of sound, the pleasures of smell, because we have these gifts of the senses that are really getting numbed out by too much activity, too much stuff, moving too fast. And so that slowing down and developing and cultivating the art of awareness and what really feels good to us, and starting with ourselves, and will actually make our experiences with our partners that much more enriching, but also to create a sense of awareness during our everyday life. Like if you're practicing this and cultivating this awareness around smell and touch and taste and sound, if you're out there having dinner with your friends, you're not going to be rushing through your meal again, right? And then you can have pleasure of really listening to them and seeing how and feeling whatever is coming up through the conversation. So I love that, again, like we said in the very beginning, if you start with yourself, with the sexuality and the sensuality, how that's going to open up more for your living your life with more beauty and richness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So am I getting a little cue here? Yes, we're getting a cue here that we're already up on our second break. See, this topic is just so, I get so excited about this and time flies. So we're going to take our last break of the show, but don't go anywhere because I'm sure this topic, this is going to get even better. So we're going to take our last break, and we'll be back with Kira Hauer.
Okay, nicely done. All clear.
The breaks are getting in the way of the conversation.
I told you I'll come back.
Mm-hmm. I know there were so many things. Like I loved everything you just said, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many different things. Like I can see we're spinning this web, and all these little, gossamer strands are going out. I'm like, oh, I want to go down that strand, and I want to go down that strand and that strand. And like, oh, we definitely have to have this conversation again.
Yeah. Well, let's see what resonates with your listeners,
Yeah,
and where they'd like to go. And I'd love to hear from people. I have you gotten many questions?
I know not yet because I am not looking at my Facebook feed.
Okay.
I'll look at it mostly because I get distracted and I just want to focus on the conversation.
All right.
But we'll definitely look into that and learning how to navigate all these different moving parts. And so
very impressive.
Yeah, fourth show only right now, so it's good. Yeah. But with our second half, are there any particular things that you really wanted to cover in the short? But like we have about 15 minutes in our second segment, our last segment. We can talk about how you work.
So much. There's just so yeah. You tell me.
I don't know.
I mean we can talk about the fact that there is a big pleasure gap in our country between men and women, and to own, to recognize that. We can talk about
because a pleasure gap is when there's it takes a lot longer for a woman to reach climax. Is that what you're talking about? The pleasure gap?
Well, just in terms of satisfaction. Satisfaction. I mean, 25 to 50% of the women in the United States are diagnosed as sexually dysfunctional, and there's just no possible way that that's a reality. The reality is that they're dissatisfied, and a lot of that has
about that because it's so frustrating to hear.
All right, sorry to jump in here, but we are coming back.
Okay.
You're listening to Women Thriving Unapologetically with Lynsie McKeown. Have a question for Lynsie or her guests? Want to share your story? Email Lynsie at thrivingunapologetically@gmail.com. That's thrivingunapologetically@gmail.com. Now back to the show. Here again is Lynsie.
Welcome back to Women Thriving Unapologetically. We are so honored to have Kira Hauer here today talking about a very important topic for women, how to thrive in intimacy and pleasure over 50, but really at any age. And Kira and I were talking during the break about what the pleasure gap is, how there is a big discrepancy between men and women in receiving and pleasure. And so let's go ahead and talk about that.
Okay. Well, the statistics are a little disheartening, but not surprising. They're in the United States, at least 25 to 50% of women are dissatisfied. The problem with that is that they are often, and too often, diagnosed with some kind of sexual dysfunction. And the reality is that so often it's not about sexual dysfunction. It's really not. It's about again, going back to the education of how female sexuality actually works. And that, let's just take, for example, how long it takes a woman to reach arousal. I'm not even talking about climax. I'm just talking about arousal. I mean, most people that I talk to will say, when I ask, how long do you think you should take to feel aroused? And they'll say, well, we should have everything done and wrapped up in 15 minutes, right? There's this 15-minute craziness that we were fed back in the, I don't know when, 70s. And it may be that men can reach arousal much faster, which is true, but on average, women take about 45 minutes. 45 minutes.
Here it is, women telling us this are the example of how to slow down.
Exactly.
Stop moving so fast. Enjoy
Exactly.
the experience of life,
Exactly.
pleasure.
Exactly. So, but that leads to then the conversation around communication. It's education, it's communication. So education also, only 25% of women can and do orgasm through penetration, through intercourse, 25%. So if women think that they are supposed to have an orgasm with intercourse, they're actually not. Their bodies don't work that way. Yeah. It's very unusual. And if they do, chances are it's because of the anatomy of them with their partner. And I won't get into that. But anyway, so there are these beliefs that women have and men have about the way their body is supposed to work that simply aren't true.
Yeah.
So educating themselves and then learning how to communicate both with vulnerability, clarity, honesty about what their desires are. And that goes back to really understanding what gets one's body aroused, right? And I think that so many women, especially the older generations, have hang-ups around masturbation and self-pleasure, and I mean, now there's a website called OMG Yes, where you can learn by younger women how to actually self-pleasure. There are so many different fabulous videos on it. It's amazing. And one of the things
that long ago in our history as women, that we weren't even allowed to be educated about our physical body or our menstrual cycles. So we're actually intentionally put in the dark and actually put in prison if we were to talk about it or try to educate other women about it. So it is about this piece about education, and then also understanding, what does please you, and being able to have that voice and communicate that.
Right.
And that piece about, being considered that we're diagnosed as having a dysfunction is a little infuriating for me. Like, no, we're, again, because it hits that area of shame,
right,
and feeling bad about ourselves and thinking something is wrong with us.
Yeah.
When actuality is just that we aren't exploring what brings us pleasure, and tapping into what, as said, is our birthright.
Right. Exactly. And I think, really understanding how a woman views her body and how she feels about her sexual self, first and foremost, is really important, and exploring that. And then what is the context with the relationship that she's in, emotional context, what's the health of the relationship, because that impacts everything.
Yeah.
And when it comes to sexuality, one thing I do want to add, though, just around the five senses is and getting to know one's body. There's a wonderful resource called the Erotic Blueprints by a woman named Jaya, and you can get it on her website. And it's a little quiz. It's kind of like the 5 love languages, and it really is helpful to be able to look to understand what your own sexual blueprint is. So
Oh,
that's a
that's a
nice
wonderful
nice
resource.
resource.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And
Yeah.
for our listeners who are in same-sex relationships, we've been talking about, everything applies here as well. So, for me personally, I identified as being heterosexual for most of my life until just a few years ago when I fell in love with a woman. And in that relationship, I was actually able to explore my sensuality in a very different way. And personally, I noticed how things open up more for me. And in a way that's like, wow, I've never experienced this before. I think one, because it was a very, very safe container to explore things. And I wasn't trying to perform for someone else's pleasure, because that was always kind of put in my head, you perform for the man. Instead, it was all this beautiful, ability to give and receive equally and be in that safe place and be vulnerable, which actually allowed for more pleasure to come to the surface.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. That's beautiful, and I'm so happy for you. The number one predictor of women's libido staying high, the number one predictor in midlife and beyond is getting a new partner, a new sexual partner. And so often my clients who are married and would like to stay married, and they've been married a long time, will say, "Oh my God, that's awful. What?" And I always say, so you have to become that partner. You both have to figure out how to change, even if it's just a little bit sexually. Yeah, what's the essence that's going to change? What are the habits that are going to change? Because our sexual vitality kind of thrives on change, and so we need to look at that. But thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful.
Yeah. And I love how and change doesn't mean going out and having an affair. It means
No,
like being
no,
honest communication with your partner and being willing to explore things. Because as you change, what brings you pleasure changes as well. I mean, what
exactly.
brought us
Yep,
pleasure in our 20s is not going to bring us pleasure in our 50s.
yep,
So we have to say, okay, like what's new and what's different? What's going to light me up now?
yeah,
So I love that.
yeah, yeah. And I think, to your point, we really need to redefine what sex looks like. It can't, our bodies age. That's a reality, right? So how do we as a couple, you know, change with that aging process? How do we redefine what sex is? And that's really important. That's an important part of the process too.
Not
And
holding
and
on to
and
what used to be, sometimes like, oh, like
exactly.
my body's, we hear people say this all the time. They're just pining away for like something that happened and who they were in the
Yep.
past or how things were in the
Yep.
past, but that just keeps you stuck and not really thriving now.
Right.
How to
Exactly.
just look
Yeah.
at yourself and your body in a way
Yeah.
that, you're in appreciation for this moment.
Yeah. And that's also, to your title, about intimacy, building emotional intimacy with somebody is saying, who are you now? And who do we want to be together?
Yes. Who do we want to be together? First, starting with
And
yourself, like what do you
yep.
vision for yourself? And then how can we grow and be together?
Right. Exactly. And making it a priority. That's a huge part of it. It's so easy for couples to just put it on the back burner,
Yeah.
and have their sexual connections be a once in a while thing. And the problem with bad sex is that people don't want to have it, so they'll avoid it, right? So we want to increase the good sex and find ways to get there so that we can have more of that,
We
right?
want to learn through positive repetition.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
And so I can't believe we only have a few more minutes to the show. So I don't want to miss the opportunity for our listeners to learn how they can work with you, or the work that you do out there with women. We've touched on it a little bit, but what would a session look like with you for a woman wanting to come in and explore her sexuality?
Well, right now I'm working entirely online, remotely, and it's really very talk based. So I do body centered practices, but there's never any kind of sexual experiences that happen in a coaching session. So I just want to put that out there. It's it really is about going into, as I said, that triad of what's happening in your body, what are the thoughts and beliefs, and what are the emotions, and we just keep circling around that, and we go deep and we come up, and and so there's lots of different ways that we get there, but I really help women to really deeply define what their desires are,
Yes.
and then figure out how to get there.
And having a guide to do that, a coach, a mentor, a guide to do that is so essential, because so many things come up that are surprising and unexpected, and having a trained person to guide you is really, really key. And I can say that from experience. So, Kira, I can't tell you enough how honored I am to have had you on the show today. And as we mentioned before, we need a lot more time. And so I do hope that you will come back. And
I will.
yeah.
I would love to. And I do want to just plug there. I do have an online course that it's self-guided, and it's the Sexuality and Aging Masterclass, which they can find on my website. So that's another possibility if you don't want to do the one-on-one coaching.
Yeah, take the masterclass. It's really powerful. I heard great feedback on it, and it's at www.kirahower.com. That's KIRAHOWER. And so what we're going to do now is just send you to that website, get in contact with her, and definitely send us some comments if you want us to answer any of your questions. And until next time, Kira, thank you so much. And thank all of you amazing women out there dedicated to your own pleasure and reclaiming your birthright to creativity and power. And continue to join us each week on Voice America's Empowerment Channel for women thriving unapologetically. And we come on live every Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific on the Voice America Empowerment Channel. And please remember to review, subscribe, and rate, and leave us a message. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, many blessings, my friends.
All right, terrific show today. All clear.
Thank you, Matt.
You're welcome. Thank you. All right, I'm going to jump out to the next show, but you both have a great day.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, I'm going to hit stop recording.